Hello and welcome to the Hub MT YouTube channel podcast brought to you by the European Digital Innovation Hub and powered by MDIA, Malta Digital Innovation Authority. Our guest today is Matthew Scerri, who is a freelance technology consultant with a particular interest in emerging technologies. Other than his work on technology regulation and strategy, he is currently engaged in the development of innovative software solutions that bring together different technology fields, such as Web3 and digital identity. I'm curious to know, and obviously you can explain this better, what are we referring to when we say digital identity?
So digital identity typically refers to your identity online, right? Nowadays, everyone uses technology. Everyone has a, online account with different retailers, possibly even with certain, technology providers like Facebook, Google, and so on and so forth. And these are all different types of digital identities. So at the end of the day, in its broad, in the broader sense of the term, that's what we mean by digital identity, your identity online. Now, typically, this has been represented by a username and a password, right?
Which is, I think, something I created.
Exactly, it's something that a lot of people are familiar with. I would say that was sort of the traditional way of digital identity. The problem with that is that you have a different identity with different entities and different businesses, for example, that you interact with. So if you register for two different e-shops or two different e-banking providers, right? That's a separate identity. That identity isn't linked together.
Okay.
So the next phase that we've seen with that is that, I'm not sure if you've ever used it, perhaps the sign in with Google button or sign in with Facebook button. That's called, some people call that federated identity, right? Because there you've essentially identified yourself with one of these technology providers, such as Google or Facebook or Microsoft or whoever, and you're using that identity to share certain aspects of your identity with businesses and, service providers.
Okay, and is this a good, because obviously the question would be, should I have one digital identity that's common to all, or should I have many identities?
So that's the whole debate, right? At the end of the day, I would say where things are headed is, I would say, the third layer and the third phase. So for example, even at the EU level, there's the eIDAS regulation that is currently being worked on. And the idea there is that you have one digital identity that is standardized, that is cross-border. You
like can actually have in real terms with my ID card, for example.
Exactly.
I don't have many, I just have one.
In fact, maybe most people don't know, is that the local ID card, you have a chip on it. That's exactly what it is for. The problem is that because of certain, I would say, regulations and the way that they've been applied and even different points of view of member states, let's put it that way, right? The impact of that has been quite limited. So what we're currently looking at is that there is eIDAS 2.0, which should be rolled out by 2026, 2027, hopefully. And that should provide the third layer, the third aspect of, your digital identity online.
And I would have one instead of multiple.
Yes, but it would actually extend beyond you just identifying yourself and having an identity in that sense. So the idea there is that if you sit for an undergrad degree at the University of Malta, right? They can issue your certificate digitally to your digital identity, right?
Okay.
And that means that you're reducing the risks for fraud. You're reducing, a lot of these risks. Because then if you want to sign up or apply for a job, for example, right? And they ask for you to sign up to have a certain level of requirements, you can very easily present your certificate, your digital certificate to this particular entity that you trust, has a legitimate reason to have that information for them to be able to verify irrefutably that you actually have that certification, and that, more importantly, that was issued by the University of Malta, for example.
Okay.
Right?
So here we're talking education, we're talking professional level. When it comes to social level, you've mentioned Facebook, Instagram. This would reduce the risk of fake profiles. Having a digital identity.
In one aspect, yes, but I would say the bigger issue, right, is I think a lot of people have heard, or at least hold the opinion, that the phone is continuously, listening to them. So if you mention something, all of a sudden you have an advert pop up, right? Now, I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that the data we're giving to these companies is so detailed without us even knowing your location, your time of, your activity throughout the day, that they can actually infer a lot of the stuff without them having to listen to us, right? So at the end of the day, these technology providers are holding vast amounts of power, right?
Away from your
away,
identity.
away from you. So what that means is that my identity,
True.
the question is that really still my identity? Do I still have ownership over my data?
Okay.
And there's still there are laws and regulations such as the GDPR, which prevents these companies from doing whatever they want. But from a user centricity standpoint, something like, where, the projects I'm working on are trying to head is to actually empower the user so that your credentials really are yours and not, held by a company on your behalf, and they can do whatever they want with it,
And there's more to what we're feeding other than my name and surname and probably age, but there's much more data I am feeding the internet with.
I mean, another example, right, that we actually came across, particularly in other jurisdictions, because I would say in Malta, maybe fortunately or not, it depends on which side of the fence you sit on. It's not, I would say it's not that enforced. But in some countries, if you go to a bar and you order, a beer or whatever, you need to provide proof that you are of a certain age. Now, in order to provide this proof, typically you give away your identity card, which has a lot more information on it than possibly you might want to give to the bartender, right? So with something like a digital identity, you can very easily have an app where the bartender can verify that you are of a certain age without you actually having to disclose all that information.
And he would only have access to that information of me, which is by age in that regard, and nothing else, which would limit that.
Exactly, but deep down, from an infrastructural standpoint, all the data is linked together in a secure and encrypted way, which only you have access to.
So I think we've established what digital identity is. What does this mean for the people and also businesses?
So, as we've mentioned and I touched upon, for the people, it should mean that it's easier for you to access digital services, right? Because instead of having to log in to on your EID for your government services and your bank, using your bank credentials to log into your bank account, you can use, in theory, you can use one and you can access that out of the box. For businesses, it's important because it gives them, so it can prevent fraud, first of all, right? Because password sharing, for example, I might mention some streaming providers that are dealing with this problem. Password sharing for a business can be a big issue. And in fact, there are laws around that very aspect as well. So something like this can actually help protect and prevent against fraud from a business standpoint. It would also make it easier for a business to be able to verify who a user is and ask for certain information. It could also create an environment where businesses can actually collaborate together, right? So I'll mention an example, which is, it's actually quite often cited. So if you're looking at onboarding as a person, I don't know, opening a bank account, for example, which I believe is one of the, EU life stories that are typically focused upon, because it's a key milestone in your life. So to open a bank account, you need to provide quite a bit of information. So if you have that information stored and that information is verified, should you actually have to go print everything out, get everything signed by a notary, verified, blah, 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 and then go, do the same process all over again? This would, having this digital identity idea would give rise to platforms where this information can be shared only once, in keeping with the once only principle at the end of the day. So I would say the ramifications of digital identity aren't necessarily just linked to a naturalized person or even a business identifying themselves.
But then what about data sharing? Because obviously then you're touching on another topic. First of all, if this technology would be able to interact with other technologies, and if by this we mean that there's going to be a lot of data sharing, digital identity and data sharing online.
Yeah, so the idea behind sort of the third layer, let's call it that, of digital identity, I mean, perhaps the more correct term is decentralized identity, right? The ID. The idea there is that the user actually holds the data. So the data can't be shared without the user providing access to it, because otherwise the data is going to be encrypted, and if it's shared without your authorization, they'll just get a bunch of garbled text. So they won't be able to make sense out of it. And this uses the sort of cryptography principles that have been, I would say, maybe not set in stone, but they have been developed since the late 70s, right? So that's the idea behind this. The idea is that ultimately, me as a naturalized person or as a digital citizen or whatever, I actually have rights over my own data, as opposed to me giving away those rights to a technology company like Google. Now, I'm not saying that Google does this, but in theory, Google has access to all my data, and they can share it. And to some extent,
I gave it to them.
to some extent, they do. And you gave access to them to do that when you signed. I accept the terms and conditions.
How many of us read those?
Exactly, it's not practical to read, right? But you're actually giving away quite a lot of power to these companies.
Very true. So I think that would make it even more safe. What are some of the challenges that are faced in the space of digital identity?
I would say the primary challenge is that it's still a fairly new industry. It's still not industry. I would say it's a new application of tried and tested technologies. I think that's perhaps the more correct term. I think the fact that legislation is still being worked on is it provides opportunity, but there's uncertainty with it, right? I mean, they go hand in hand in reality. But I would say those are some of the main things. I think as we go along and as things progress and as people start to maybe become even more aware than they are nowadays, and solutions are actually practical. Ideally, solutions shouldn't be solutions that a geek like me can use, but the someone who uses technology as a means to an end can also use. I think these things will continuously grow. I mean, one other problem we're seeing is that while there's a lot of standards and protocols, and some of them are competing with each other, these are all very much at draft stage. So if you're developing a system, there's still that element of, am I going to need to change this at a later date? So I liken it a lot to, if you remember, the whole competition between Blu-ray and HD DVD. Back, what was it, 10, 15 years ago? There was the same thing between VHS and another,
True.
So it's a natural process, and I think in any way, while this is a challenge, it's also going to help make sure that the standard that we come up with is actually robust, because it had to compete to become the de facto standard.
Do you think, in some terms, we're still at the experimentation phase of all this? Because it's like, one thing you say is established, we have digital ID cards, and then one thing you say, but we're still experimenting on this, but not everyone. For example, if we take our ID card, it's not across all sectors in the government field that they have my information.
I mean, I would say when it comes to technology, you're always experimenting. So I've been in this industry for almost 15 years now, and the only thing that remained constant is that you're always playing around with new technologies, new standards, new applications of them. I mean, we've seen what happened in the Web3 space, which is also another, aspect. When you talk about blockchain, for example, how does that interplay with digital identity? The whole anonymity aspect of it, which some people, in my opinion, misunderstand. So I would say the reason why I'm in technology is specifically because technology is constantly evolving, and I don't think that's going to change. I think if anything, it's going to increase rapidly, the rate of evolvement, and while it may plateau at some point, research is going to still keep on going.
In fact, I was going to ask you what you think the future would hold in this regard. Where would this take us?
I mean, it's all very sort of hypothetical, right? But I think I'm
not expecting you to read the future.
No. I mean, I'm not sure I want to be able to read the future, to be fair. But I think looking at the future, hopefully these things become more accepted. And I think by more accepted, I also mean that they become ingrained in our legislation, for example. So one of the issues I've come across with throughout my professional life quite regularly is that you're often trying to push technology. The technology is tried and tested, it can do something, but the legislation prevents you from doing it, right? So for example, I'll mention digital signatures. So me as a technologist, I would trust something signed digitally a lot more than a scribble on a piece of paper, right? But from a legal standpoint, at least from conversations I've had with various notaries and lawyers, they tell you that from a legal standpoint, that scribble on a piece of paper is legally recognized far better than a digital mathematical proof.
Because things legally move slower than technology moves faster.
I wouldn't necessarily say they move slower. I think from a legal standpoint, for something to be and I need to be fair here, while sort of
because the laws change, the changing in the laws is much more slower than the rapid changes in technology.
But I think if something is going to be changed in law, we need to be absolutely sure that everyone is comfortable and confident about it.
Yes.
So I would say I'd rather err on the side of caution than having laws that are changing rapidly, because that creates uncertainty then.
True.
Right? But I do believe that from a future standpoint, and I do hope that technology becomes more intrinsic within legislation. And to be fair, we're at the MDIA today. That's sort of a very big part of what the MDIA is doing, and that's
there's an authority for this.
Exactly, that's one of the main reasons behind the formation of the MDIA. And I genuinely believe, I've said this a number of times, that from a sort of future standpoint, I think each country needs to have eventually its own version of the MDIA, and specifically for this sort of thing, to legislate, so that from a technology standpoint, we can legislate to have, ultimately to give the people more rights, protection, and to an extent power as well.
Out of curiosity, Matthew, what were you doing before you entered this field?
Oh, well, so I
what inspired you to?
I usually describe myself maybe a bit cheekily, right, as a geek, but I am really and truly. So I've spent, I think, 15 years of my professional life as a software developer, working anything from automotive systems to e-commerce platforms, up to more recently, I spent 8 years in consultancy, so consulting on national EU projects, for example, and that exposed me to having to work with lawyers, accountants, for example, auditors, and they're all coming from very different backgrounds. And I think one of the things we need to do is we need to start to speak the same language a bit more. And more recently, even, I've worked in the Web3 and blockchain space because, it's quite interesting as well. I'm always looking for the bleeding edge of technology, I guess.
As a final thought also from your end, what would you leave our audience with as a message, even when it comes to startups and people who are thinking of perhaps doing that leap?
Yeah, I think, so having been in the startup space exclusively for the last 3-4 years, I think one of the things that we really need to change as a society in a way, right, is how we view startups and how we view failure more than anything. Startups, some of them are inevitably going to fail. But a failure in a startup is not necessarily the end of the world, because usually from a failed startup, you have a lot of intellectual property, you have a lot of knowledge and education that's been learned, and the experience is absolutely, that's not something that you can buy or you can get from any educational institution. So personally, I think the sentiment, and I hope this is something that the startup community starts working towards, the sentiment needs to change in that we don't view as someone who had a failed startup as a failure, but rather as someone who's experienced, and we need to encourage them to take their next best idea and try to innovate, because eventually something is going to stick.
As you previously mentioned before, but I would like to close off also on this note, what's the influence of authorities like MDIA on founders like yourself and startups? What's the influence on having an authority?
I think it's good because it provides sort of, from an authority standpoint and from a government standpoint, it provides a point of reference, right? So if I'm building something within the digital identity space, I can have conversations with the authority. I can sort of see what makes sense, what doesn't, where things are headed. I know that sort of from an authority standpoint here, they're also very present within EU fora. So they can also give some information and direction on where things are headed more from a European standpoint and potentially even a global standpoint. But I also think that from an authority's point of view, it's important to also make sure that the actors and startups and even scale-ups and SMEs working in this industry are actually doing the things as they're saying they're doing, right? There's no taking people for a ride, which ultimately is sort of a very important part of an aspect of what an authority should be.
And that's regulated. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was a pleasure having you on board. That was Matthew Scerri, and we'd like to thank our audience for watching.